from last time. If people have a motion, I would entertain it and we can get on with that part of it.
Yeah, I move to approve the minutes.
I'll second it.
Great. We can do a voice vote. Everybody in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Anybody against, say no.
Aye.
All right, we're good. So let's move on to the action items. So I guess I'm not sure who's going to take this on, whether that's Millman or Sam or Stacy.
Hey, Josh, I'll do a quick intro, but Kathy, do we have to see about public testimony? Is there any public testimony?
Oh, that's right. Sorry.
No, I don't believe there is, but Rick, has anyone signed up at the last minute?
I didn't think there was any. That's why I just moved on. Sorry.
I don't believe so. I'll check again. I'll have to get back to you in a few minutes. Go ahead.
Okay.
As of yesterday, no one had signed up, so.
All right, well, I'll just do a quick intro for Millman, and Rick, you can just interrupt us if there is any public testimony. But we have with us today our fearless actuaries who periodically appear before you, although not usually from their homes, so that's kind of exciting. But we have with us from Milliman, Matt Larrabee, Scott Preppernow, and also Gary Deeth, and they are our actuarial team at Milliman. And I think, as most of you know, there are dozens of assumptions that go into calculating our plan liability every year. And some of those assumptions are updated every year, and some are updated every other year. But the vast majority of assumptions are updated less frequently based on a plan experience study, where we look at the actual participant experience in the plan over a longer period of time. And those are things, I mean, Matt and Scott are going to go through these with you guys, but things like how many of our members are married and therefore will have survivor benefits, how many live in Oregon in retirement and therefore will have an additional tax offset benefit. So the last experience study was presented to the board in 2014 based on data from 2008 through 2013. And best practice is to conduct an experience study every 5 years or so with our small plan. And given that we don't use our liability to determine contributions, we can go a little bit longer in between. But it has been 6 years, so we contracted with Milliman to do a new plan experience study. And this study is based on data from July of 2014 through June of 2019. So they're going to go over their findings, as well as the assumption changes that they recommend we make going forward as the basis for calculating future plan liability. And I think this stuff is super interesting, and I know Trustee McLeod does as well. The rest of you I'm less sure about, but I have faith in Matt and Scott to make it very interesting. So I'll turn it over to you two, and thanks for being here today.
All right. I wish I held the same level of confidence in the interesting level of our material, Stacy, but that was a very good introduction all the same. Good to see everybody. I hope everybody's safe, and I'm glad that we can all, if we choose to have our windows open rather than having to have towels underneath them this fine afternoon like we would have if we had the meeting last week. So, Scott, I don't know if you're able to, if we're going to share a screen or whatever, but if we can put our presentation up, that might be helpful.
Here, and tell me if you can see it okay here in just a minute.
Perfect. It's coming up.
Okay.
Yep. And if you can turn to slide 2, that would be great. Thank you, Scott.
Okay.
So yeah, my name is Matt Larrabee. I'm one of the actuaries with Milliman. All three of us, Scott and Gary and myself, we've all worked with Fpdr for around about 10 years or so as the actuaries on the program. We're all Portland residents as well. Stacy gave a very good introduction there. While we do evaluation every year, and that's important work, we're trying to look into the future as best we can with assumptions and try to estimate what the cash outlay, the contributions, and the benefit payments will be from the program year over year into the future for the membership. It is a best practice every 4 or 6 years to take a look at the assumptions that you have in place by reviewing, kind of the data that we have for the members in the system, both retired and active, and either affirm that the assumptions that we have are proper and reasonable, or where necessary, make recommendations. So that's referred to as an experience study process. That's what we'll be doing today. The end result will be, we'd like, it's an action item for the board because we'd like your approval on a couple of updates to certain assumptions that based on experience, we feel merit adjustment. While there's a decent amount of material and we enjoy talking about it, the kind of to cut to the chase on a lot of this, while we have a number of suggestions, the changes to our projections from the assumption recommendations will be rather modest, put in kind of present day value, present day dollar terms as a liability. The combination of our recommended assumptions is going to slightly decrease the calculated liability in the neighborhood of 1.5% or so. So kind of keep that materiality, very modest materiality threshold in mind. This chart we have on this page here, the first slide of the presentation, we do these evaluations every 2 years. Really the core goal of those valuations is to try to estimate year by year what the benefit payments will be from the system. And since we have a pay-as-you-go system for Fpdr, those are equivalent to the contributions that would come in on the tax levy. It is a very long-term calculation, as you can see from this green bar chart on the bottom right here. These are excluding contributions to PERS for the Fpdr3 members. These are our projected benefit payments. And so even though Fpdr1 and 2 are both closed systems, Fpdr2 being closed back in 2006. Even with that closure, due to the continuation of active service, because, you know, a typical public safety career can be in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 years, and then the relatively long duration of benefit payments after that, typical retirement ages happen to be in the mid-50s to early 60s for most participants, so you're going to have payouts of 25 or 30 years. This is really a long-term calculation, even with the system. The Fpdr2 portion of the system having been closed 14 years ago, we don't expect benefit payments as shown in this green bar. This was from our prior valuation to peak until around still 15 to 20 years from now in the window of 2035 to 2040. So given that this is a very long-term modeling exercise that we do when we do the valuations, assumptions play a key role in that, if you will. A couple of key ones, those are the ones we highlight today. So Scott, if you could turn to the next slide, if you would. So we do evaluation every 2 years. Last one was run in 2018. Next one we would present to the board, I believe, probably on the forward agenda, probably in the January 2021 meeting. When we did our last valuation 2 years ago, it was based on the previous experience study that Stacy noted from 6 years ago. We did update the mortality assumption since then. We try to kind of mirror the mortality assumption for life expectancy that's used by the public safety officials for Oregon PERS. It's statistically a more credible population, but it's still public safety specific, and studies have shown that public safety personnel do have different life expectancies and different mortality patterns than either private sector personnel or general service personnel or teachers in government. But we want to have something that's statistically credible and matches to the state of Oregon, which is larger. So that's our population there. So we do have a few assumptions, and there will be an assumption update, I think, on mortality as well, but wanted to kind of cue that up here. So Scott, if you could turn to the next slide. So Stacy mentioned some of this already. We have what's called an observation period for most of our demographic recommendations, things like the likelihood that somebody would leave prior to retirement age, the likelihood of a disability in the context that we talk about disability. We'll get to that. Things like retirement patterns. We're looking at data over a 5-year observation period that ran from 2014 to 2019. That data was provided to us by Fpdr staff. We looked at a slightly narrower window for salary. We looked at a 4-year window, and we did have discussions with Fpdr staff about, you know, some of the contractual changes that have happened and been implemented during that 4-year period. All that said, we can really divide our assumptions into 2 broad categories, and we'll take them in separate sections of our material. One is economic, and as one is demographic, and as best we can, we're trying to cover highlights in this material, but the full detail of all of our methodology and recommendations can be found in the appendix of the assumptions, so that if there's a board motion to adopt the recommendations that we have, that the record is there documentation-wise to be able to know what is being specifically recommended for adoption. Next slide, please, Scott. And so with that, so we've got economic and demographic. I am going to turn it over to Scott because I thought it would be a fun and exciting opportunity for him to talk to the city's economists about what inflation is and recommendations and things like that.
Yes, thanks very much, Matt. All right, so slide 6 that you see in front of you. This first section, we're going to focus, as Matt said, on economic assumptions, which are much more sort of, macro, not specific to Fpdr experience specifically. And so we'll talk through that, and then we'll transition over into the demographic section that does reflect more Fpdr experience and what we saw there. And Gary and I will walk through that piece next. But for the economic assumptions, you see the handful here that we have to talk through, including what we're calling the current assumptions or the last valuation assumptions. So inflation, real wage growth, the sum of those two is overall payroll growth that we expect for the system, and then separately discount rate. So we'll go through each of these in turn, but you can see the current inflation assumption at 2.75, real wage growth assumption of 1%. Those combined to be a 3.75% payroll growth assumption that we use in last valuation and levy modeling. And then the discount rate for a plan that is primarily pay-as-you-go like Fpdr, the kind of appropriate basis to use for this under the GASB standards is really a municipal bond rate. And so there's a specific index that we use for that. And you can see both the 3.87% discount rate we used at the last valuation, and then sort of the interim update in 2019, fiscal year in 2019, accounting, that rate had dropped down to 3.5, and we'll give you an update on where that is right now. So taking a little more detailed look at inflation, the inflation assumption in the valuation is kind of a building block for some other pieces. Clearly, inflation can vary significantly over time. The table shown in the top right of this chart shows kind of a trailing 10, 20, 30, 40 year period through the end of 2019. And we've got, as low as under 2% for the most recent 10 years and as high as 3% for a long period. While we want to kind of pay attention to history and be cognizant of it, we're trying to set a forward-looking assumption, so we don't really use that directly, but we want to be mindful of it. The way we kind of survey the potential kind of range of inflation assumptions is really twofold. We look at sort of a market-based measure, which is the bottom right table you'll see here, which by comparing treasuries and TIPS, inflation-adjusted treasuries, you can get sort of a rule of thumb kind of break-even inflation estimate for 10 or 30 year period out of the market. And we've shown that this time at 2 dates, both the end of 2019, so before the pandemic, and as of June 30, so as of this valuation date. And you see at both periods, the 10 and 30 year inflation numbers are quite low relative to history. They're well below 2%, even more so at the June 30 number. If you look at the June 30, the fact that TIPS actually have a negative yield sort of speak to the state of the world at the moment and the unusual place we're at relative to history. So that, the market's treasury information, we're certainly indicating low forward-looking inflation. But in addition to that, we do like to look at sort of projections from other parties that have long-term inflation assumptions. So Social Security, for example, has an intermediate cost 30-year average inflation assumption that's now at 2.4%. That's down from 2.6% as of last year. Not shown on the slide, but there's some other groups out there. So Federal Reserve Bank of both Philadelphia and Cleveland have some kind of closely watched surveys and models on this that are both right around 2% these days. Similarly for a survey of Economist Blue Chip Financial Forecast is in that same region. So all that said, we recommend that the current 2.75 inflation assumption be lowered, and we proposed 2.25, which sits kind of between sort of the 2.4 of Social Security and more of the 2% that we've seen in a few other spots, and is kind of squarely in the range of what we would consider reasonable. So I'll pause there for any questions specific to this, but we'll also have time for questions at the end of this section as well.
Scott, can you tell us what, this is Kathy, can you tell us what Oregon PERS is currently assuming for long-term inflation?
So Oregon PERS is currently at 2.5%, and that will be reviewed again next year because they do a biannual experience study.
Okay, thanks.
And important to note also, I mentioned how discount rate is a little different here than others. Because this is not a pre-funded plan, the inflation assumption here is not used for building an investment return assumption that's used for a discount rate as it is for, say, an Oregon PERS or other pre-funded plans. Here it is a matter of this affects some pieces of our evaluation that we project out benefit payments and how much both like Fpdr 1 COLA grows and some pay related pieces in the valuation as well. Okay. All right, so if no further questions on that, I'll jump to slide 8.
Could I?
Oh,
sorry,
yeah.
Could I chime in? So Chair Harwood, this is one of the assumptions that Scott and I spent quite a bit of time some time talking about. And since you didn't chime in, I'm going to force you to chime in and get your thoughts on that assumption, that 2.25%, since you are very attuned to inflation, although not necessarily over such long periods of time.
Yeah. Thanks, Stacey. No, I think you're trending in the right direction. I mean, inflation forecasts are always about 18 months out from going back to some level of like normalcy. And so in this case, this seems the right trend. I think you might be a little bit higher in the 10-year and a little bit lower in the 40-year, but just because I think that the Federal Reserve Bank has really made this a priority, and they're assuming you have the same makeup on the Federal Reserve Bank, you're going to see some level of stability that's probably a little bit more than what you're reflecting, but I mean, we're talking about very small differences. So it makes sense to me, everything that you guys said.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Chair Harwood.
All right. Slide 8, the real wage growth assumption. So in addition to inflation, over time, it's expected that overall wages do increase some level above that, largely due to competitive market pressures. And this is sort of separate and distinct from an individual who may, kind of get raises and step increases through the course of their career. This is more like overall wage increases in advance of inflation. This is definitely a bumpy ride, as you can see from kind of the historical chart in the upper right here, but it does trend positive over time. The table in lower right shows, again, sort of trailing historical periods between, around, well, I guess 0.59% at the low and up to 0.92% in the high depending on what period you look at. Again, looking at some sort of Social Security or CBO's forward-looking numbers on this. Social Security is at 1.1% at the moment. Others are in that range. So in our opinion, the current assumption of 1% is still reasonable, and we would keep that, which means that with lowering inflation to 2.25 and keeping a 1% here, then we're also lowering our total payroll growth, which is the sum of those two, from 3.75 to 3.25 forward looking. Any questions on that? Last economic assumption shown here. So this is the discount rate. And as I alluded to, this is really a municipal bond index that is used for GASB purposes. So we also use that for our valuation interest rate and discount rate here, which it's given the pay-as-you-go nature of the plan is appropriate. And we like kind of the harmony of having one set of discount rates we're looking at, just the GASB set. The chart here shows where this index has been really since the advent of GASB brought this this methodology. And not a surprise given where interest rates are overall. It's gone down over this time frame, and it's gone down a lot in the last few months. So where we're at 3.87% at the last valuation date, and then 3.5% for the kind of interim update, it's now down to 2.21% at the end of June. That number's already been reflected in the GASB financial update that we do as of the end of the fiscal year end 2020. So that's been reflected there, but we'll also build that into this upcoming valuation. And what that does, it doesn't really change. If you think back to the chart Matt had earlier with the projected green bars, it doesn't really change the projected benefit payments in the future or really the levy modeling because of that, but it does affect what you consider the present value of that given stream of benefit payments. And so it marks up the liability as, you know, that's already, as I said, come through in the most recent financial statements for GASB. And I think since June, the rates have been right around the same spot. So they haven't gone too much up or down since then, but they do, you know, they do bounce around over time, clearly. All right, so just to summarize, the economic assumptions here on 10 really covers what we already talked about in the last few slides. I'll pause there one more time for questions, and then Gary's going to start the demographic assumptions, and I'll jump back in a few more minutes. Questions there?
Actually, this is Kathy again. Yeah. When you talk about the payroll growth of 3.25%, are you still adding any additional like merit or longevity kind of stuff for individual employees in the projections, or is this your assumption?
Trustee McLeod, excellent question. And that is actually, we will add a piece, and that's what we're going to talk about next in the demographic. That's perfect. The next one up.
Well, there we go. I'll be quiet then.
Okay.
Thanks.
No, perfect. Thanks. Gary, I don't think we can hear you.
Nothing.
It's pretty quiet. Okay.
Right, probably just you go ahead then.
Okay, I'll go ahead, and then yeah, if you have something to add, go ahead and shout as much as you can. All right, so slide 12, moving on to the individual member salary increase. So as Trustee McLeod gave us that perfect segue, when we turn to look at what an individual member's pay profile is over their career, you not only have the inflation and kind of general increase, but you have, and certainly depending on sort of the time of the career and age and service, or service steps, I should say, you have what we would call longevity or merit increases as that individual earns promotions or gets step increases. So to evaluate where we're at on this, we looked at data from 2015 to 2019, and we did make one adjustment to it in that there was a very significant series of increases to the PPA contract in this period that affected 3 out of the 4 sort of change points that we have in that period. And our understanding is that is, you know, if we fully reflected that, it would be overstating, given that historical period we're looking at, overstating our forward-looking expectations. So we partially adjusted and backed out essentially 2% of that 3% increase, so that we were not kind of knowingly skewing that forward-looking expectation. And then, so that's built into the data you'll see here. The resulting assumption that we get to does vary by service, and I'll kind of walk through each one separately. So on slide 13, the graph shown here is for police members. And just to kind of orient to what we're seeing here, the dashed red line is where the current assumption is. The blue line is what the actual experience we saw over this 4-year period looked like. And then the green is where we have kind of drawn the new proposed assumption, which, you know, generally tracks with the experience and with a little bit of smoothing out in spots. Couple important things to note here, and certainly what catches the eye is if you look at the current assumption in those first couple of years, it was really high at the last study, and now it's dropped down quite a bit, both the experience and the proposed. That's really kind of an artifact of the change in the entry rate pay level for police officers. So before, what we used to see was that after 6 months, there was a really big pay increase. And now with the elimination of that entry rate pay, we now have a smaller percentage increase, but it's on a bigger base. So just to keep in mind kind of what's going on there. And the other thing that you will see is that we're now explicitly reflecting sort of these, if you can see my mouse here, the sort of peaks at key anniversary ages that we saw both in the data and that we were aware of for longevity bumps in the contracts. Before, we had kind of just smoothed those into the overall level through there, but we're being a little bit more clear and sort of explicit in the way we do that now. So that's the police chart. I'll jump to the fire, but then if there's questions on either, we could certainly jump around. Fire experience, there's a little bit less visual difference on from current assumption to experience and proposed here, but we are doing the same thing about more clearly reflecting the anniversary longevity bumps, and otherwise, making some small updates to track the experience we've seen. Pause there for any questions. Okay, next major demographic assumption, retirement rates. So the current rates that we were starting from, we had separate police rates from fire rates, but they varied based on age only, and they went from age 50 to 65 for police and from age 50 to 60 for fire. So we're recommending a couple main things here. Again, these charts on this page are starting with police. We're recommending changing the format to use age-based rates for members who are retirement eligible below 25 years of service, but then to look at 25 years and up separately. So the 25 plus is the leftmost graph you'll see here. And we kind of see all the way from 50 to 65, pretty elevated, what we're calling this is observed rate here. Again, the experience is the blue line. And while it bounces around a little bit, it stays, pretty high and fairly consistent when you look at it. And so we're proposing an ultimate rate there of the green line, which is, I believe, 45%, if I'm interpolating that correctly. Under 25 years, we still will have it age-based, and that starts at 55 because that's when eligibility starts if you don't have 25 years of service. But you can see, kind of comparing either the blue or the green lines between these two charts, that there's a really, for police members especially, there's a big and kind of consistent increase in retirement rates, no matter what age you are, once you've achieved 25. So we kind of want to break those up and be able to look at those separately. Okay. Slide 16, same sort of pair of graphs for fire. Similar story in what we're doing here. It's less noticeable as far as the 25 plus versus under 25 disconnect. The thing that was noticeable on fire is that I mentioned before, our rates had cut off at 60, which meant that we essentially assumed 100% at 60, and anyone over that we assumed retired immediately, was the convention in our evaluation. We're certainly now seeing some more fire members stay on and work past 60 than we did in the past. And so we're going to extend these rates out to 65, just the same we do for police. Any questions on retirement rates at all? Or slide 17, summarized in this table, there's a handful of kind of, lesser, smaller assumptions kind of tied into retirement or elections at retirement. And I'll really just focus on the ones that have changed, but happy to answer questions on others as well. So the second row, the percent married, we look at this for, given recent retirements, how many of them were married and had a spouse at the time of retirement, and that rate has trended down a little bit. We'd assumed 80% in the past, and now it's closer to 70, so we're going to lower that assumption going forward. The other one, out-of-state retirees. So this affects the eligibility for the tax remedy benefit that someone gets paid if they're subject to Oregon income tax and not if they're not. So last time we had that at 20% out-of-state retirees. We've seen that bump up to almost 30%. And so we propose reflecting that change in the assumption here. And the last one I was going to call out, even though there's no change on it, the 27 pay period adjustment, as board members may remember, we've talked about this a few times in the past. We've added a load for the fact that some portion of members will get 27 pay periods in their final one-year averaging period. And we'd had a 2.5% load to the system average, to the pay to reflect sort of a system average that would be equivalent to about 65%, taking it or retiring in a period that qualifies for 27 pay periods in their final averaging. It happens that our observed experience over this time frame was right around 65%, so we're maintaining that assumption.
This is Kathy. I have just a couple questions about the marriage assumption.
Yeah.
Did you take a look separately for police and fire?
I don't know that we looked at police and fire separately, and Gary, you can remind me if I'm blanking on that at the moment. We did look at this different by gender, and that actually did show a difference with female retirees being lower, but based on the size of the group over the period here and kind of where this was in the last study versus now, it bounced around quite a bit, and we didn't want to be, kind of taking noise for signal there, so we're still setting this on a unisex basis. Okay.
Just in my experience, I see, I've seen a bigger difference, I think, between police and fire in different public plans. So I'd be curious about that. I certainly wouldn't advocate for a change here, but just curious. And also just for my own education, is how does the existence of a spouse ultimately affect the benefit value? Is it subsidized to some extent for the spouse? Or is it a true actuarial equivalence in theory, so it doesn't really add to the cost of the plan?
So it comes in a couple spots. One is the automatic 25% survivor benefit is payable to a spouse. And without a spouse, that wouldn't be payable at the 2.8% of pay formula.
Okay.
So that is an effect. And then also for thinking of this, I guess, pre-retirement death benefit assumptions would be affected as well.
Okay. But within the optional forms chosen at retirement, is the plan, I just don't recollect, is the plan designed so that the optional form equivalence when somebody's retiring is intended to be essentially actuarially equivalent, or is there likely a subsidy built in for a spouse?
So it actually, the form of it is actually that unlike a lot of plans as you'd be familiar with, Kathy, where there's an explicit sort of JNS reduction based on what percentage of survivor you is elected. This actually comes through in the first line here, the benefit form elected. So the 2.8% of pay formula, for example, applies for a 25% JNS. But if someone wants a 50% JNS, then their final average pay factor is 2.6%, and so on down.
Okay.
So there's sort of a set schedule that is not, it's maybe actuarially inspired, but it's not a specific formula. So there is some element of subsidy built into that.
Okay, but then that goes back to what you were saying at first, is really the pre-retirement benefit, survivor benefit, or that 25% survivor benefit that's built in, or
right.
A joint benefit. Okay, thanks very much.
You're welcome. And just to circle back on your other question, Gary did point out to me that we did have, if we look at fire and police different, they actually both were near 80%. So fire was at 80%, police members were 77%. for the marriage assumption.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, okay. Wait. I'm sorry.
oh,
I'm
yeah.
sorry. Wait a second. Can we go back there?
Other questions? Yeah,
So
of
you
course.
said fire is at 80 and police were at 70, but your new assumption
Oh.
is 70. Did I?
No,
did I hear
sorry.
that
I
right?
think I.
I'm glad you said something, Trustee.
No. Thank you.
I was just about to say, wait a minute, what?
Gary, are you able to unmute and follow up on that, or?
Hi, can you hear me at all?
Yeah, just speak loudly.
So sorry about that. I think the difference, I was just pulling this directly from our data. So I think it's just that I filtered on a different group. So if you give me a couple of minutes, I'll just make sure.
Okay.
we get it.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. We'll go back to that. Okay. All right. Slide 18. So this is withdrawal, which means leaving prior to retirement eligibility. We continue to see, relative to other pension plans, really low withdrawal rates in FPDR. When we looked into this a little further, though, and sort of break apart the assumption, their police rates are higher than fire rates. Fire rates are extremely low. Police rates are just low relative to other pension plans. So while experience was not terribly dissimilar to what we had in the current assumption, by breaking these apart, we can adjust these a little bit, and fire is a little lower, police is a little higher, and that's what we'd recommend going forward. Again, given that it is such a low withdrawal rate after the first couple of years, this isn't really what's driving the projected benefit payments or the results, but we do like to be able to see that separately.
So this is Josh. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
I think I should know this, so I'm a little embarrassed to ask it. But to the extent that are we just flatlining all of these assumptions, or is there a trend sort of built into it over time? Because I think I was just looking at the out of state piece, for instance. I'm trying to just understand that level of analysis.
We are generally applying these assumptions throughout the projection period.
Okay.
So we don't, for example, assume 30% out of state that trends to 25 or 35 over a time frame. We don't really have any reason to expect that. We could if we have that kind of sort of select and then ultimate assumption if we had good reason to expect in a given that kind of behavior in a given area, but nothing really that we're talking about today do we have that going on.
No, that makes some sense. I mean, I think that you're looking over a long enough time frame that it makes sense to sort of anchor it at the level. I just was curious as to the extent that we're sort of doing that level of difference thing.
Oops. Hey, and Board Member McLeod, I want to jump in here. I've got a louder microphone and a louder voice than Gary does. So to bounce back to your question on the marriage, there is that bifurcation between the classes that you might have expected if we look at the retirements during the experience period. While overall we're at 69%, so our recommendation is to move to a 70% married assumption. It is in the low 80s, like 81, 82% for fire, and in the mid 60s for police, around 64, 65%. So the center of gravity is weighted a little bit more towards police, which is why the overall assumption is at the 70% range. And we felt like it would be appropriate to keep that as one assumption because the plans are not funded separately. So we would get to kind of the right place overall for the program, even if we do have that bifurcation of experience between the two types of staff members, if you will, in the program.
Okay. Thanks for looking at that.
Slide 19, looking at what we've called here annual incidence of long-term disability. So this is transitioning from active membership to long-term disability, so monthly disability, not short-term, not biweekly. This is the second time we've studied this assumption since the 2006 reforms. The last study we did had shown a marked decrease in long-term disability at that time, and this has continued that trend. So if you kind of look at the table below, there's a couple sample rates of the likelihood of transitioning to long-term disability. Under the current assumption, over the period we studied, we would have had 11.6 expected members going to long-term disability. In the gray box, you can see over this period, actually 6 did. So we're kind of partway adjusting that table down, scaling it down to where now under the proposed assumption, we'd be a little bit over 8. So we're coming partway down to that experience. I did want to mention for this study, we didn't look at the full 5 years because these things can have a tail from how long it takes for someone to initiate and qualify for and then show up in our data as long-term disability. So we really focused on the early years of the study, not the most recent 2, because those may not really have popped up in our data yet that ultimately were triggered by experience in those years. So just to make sure we're not missing a tail there. Okay. Slide 20, Matt already alluded to this earlier as far as the mortality assumption. We do kind of piggyback on Oregon PERS assumptions given the larger, more credible data there, given that death rate at any given age is a low, thankfully a low number, low percentage. You need a lot of data to get a good read on it. The most recent PERS study, and again, we do those every 2 years. Most recent update, life expectancy for police and fire members within PERS actually came down. So it's shown in the table there, kind of looking at future life expectancy for a given retiree who's say 55 in 2020, if before the future lifetime was expected to be 31.6 years. Now it's 30.7 under the new assumption. And really what that is that the prior assumption had assumed a little faster future mortality improvement than the current one does. And so then when you reflect that, you end up with a shorter future life expectancy. Slide 21 goes into a little more detail on this in that the updated PERS assumptions, which were published about this time last year, were the first that were able to reflect what are called Pub 2010 tables. So the Society of Actuaries published a public plan specific mortality table for the first time in kind of the modern era. And that included specific tables for public safety members based on public safety experience across the country. And then the Oregon PERS study, we could calibrate that and make sure that it fit with Oregon experience and adjust as need be to fit with Oregon experience. And then that's kind of what we're planning to use here. We think that's a better read on police and fire members than the prior kind of option that was available of kind of blending 2 different tables that weren't explicitly public safety. So that's, again, there's details in the appendix, happy to answer questions on it, but that's kind of the approach on it.
And one other thing I'd jump in there to mention on that mortality table is that these pub tables, as they're referred to, this was a really extensive study that spread across the country, specific to public safety personnel. So we both matched that table to Oregon specific experience, so calibrated, but also Oregon PERS public safety was a significant contributor to the underlying data in that study. So it makes us even more comfortable with the recommendation here.
All right. Slide 22 just summarizes, sort of have it in snapshot in one spot, assumptions we've discussed on the prior few slides. And then lastly, wanted to wrap up on what these assumptions did to the liability if you were measuring this as of the June 2018 valuation at the 387 discount rate. This table really is what Matt alluded to earlier with the reduction in liability by about 1.5%. So we show a few different numbers on here. The top row is first one to focus on, present value projected benefits. So that's really present value of all those future benefit payments. And then the prior row, or the rows below those, accrued liability is kind of the subset of that that's considered allocated to past service. And then the future normal costs are the part that's considered in the future. And the bottom line, the normal cost, is kind of 1 year sliver out of that future normal cost. But both the present value projected benefits and the accrued liabilities dropped by about 1.5% with all these changes. Most of that was actually the mortality and the projecting less future improvement. The other pieces, while there were some ups and downs between, the salary and the retirement and all this, they were more or less offsetting between them and didn't move the needle that much. Important to note, this doesn't reflect the new GASB discount rate that will be used, in the lower discount rate will mark up the present value significantly, as we mentioned. But this is sort of to illustrate the demographic pieces. And then it also doesn't reflect any change to FPDR2 COLA assumption, which Matt will address here in just a moment.
Hey, Scott, if you could go back to that other slide just for 1 second, to kind of further point out something to the board that I think you've got at already, which is, they're on the inactive side, which is really retirees and survivor beneficiaries. There was really only one recommendation, one assumption that affects them, which is life expectancy. How long will the benefit be paid? We lowered the life expectancy, and so you can see on that inactive liability line that lowered the liability for the currently retired and beneficiary group by about $50 million. All of the other assumption recommendations that we were carrying on about the changes to the salary increase, changes to the retirement patterns, changes to the pre-retirement withdrawal patterns, and bifurcating the experience between police and fire, splitting that out, a little bit of a tweak to the disability. We did all of that in addition to changing the mortality outlook for the active employees, and it didn't move that needle even 0.01 on our chart. So in the actives, we tried to follow where the numbers took us, and we made a bunch of assumption recommendations on the actives, and it did not move our number there. So anyway, a little context. So yeah, if you could go to the future COLA assumption, we've got, I think, 3 more slides here. So, each and every time we do evaluation, and we do one every 2 years, we need to make an assumption, modeling assumption about what the future COLA policy may be each and every year in the future. When we did this and performed the evaluation in 2018, after discussion, we used what we refer to as a modified PERS approach. I think that's our terminology. I believe it may have been one that was used by staff as well. And that is, it's a bifurcated COLA assumption. It looks at each individual retiree that's FPDR2 and says, okay, how much of that retiree service was prior to October of 2013, and how much of it was after October 2013, and then we blend. We would blend a 2% COLA for the portion of service that was pre-2013, and a 1.25% COLA for the portion that was after 2013. So that was the approach that we used when we did the 2018 valuation and informed the financial reporting. Very important note, so we've got that in bold here. Of course, the assumption that we use to do all of our forward-looking modeling, it doesn't determine the actual COLA that's adopted by the board every year. The board retains full discretion to adopt each year's COLA as it sees fit, as that's well within the city charter parameters. We just need to have some modeling assumption in place and some guidance from the board to essentially help the city with the cash flow modeling and also with the development of the financial reporting. So if you turn on to the next slide, please, Scott. So I mentioned that we used kind of in our valuation, our last full valuation 2 years ago, we used a modified PERS approach. Now the actual COLA amounts that were approved by the board in 2019 and 2020, neither one of those hewed exactly to the modified PERS approach. 2019, rather than a modified approach whatsoever, it was just a straight 2% COLA across the board. And the 2020 COLA was a bit of a variation on the modified PERS approach. Rather than what we'd modeled, which was a split of 2% and 1.25%, it was a split of 2% and 1.75%. To give a sensitivity of the forward-looking work that we do, The table here on this slide shows kind of two ends of the spectrum. Modified PERS, which is that blending of the 2 and 1 1/4. That's on the left. That would give us a present value benefits of about $3.9 million. On the other hand, if we had said, you know what, just 2% every year in the future and use that as the model, the difference would be about $100 million more in our calculated present value benefits, about a 2.5% difference. So that's kind of in terms of the modeling that we do and what would show up on the financial statements, you know, where the board asks us to land just in terms of our modeling. We're talking about, you know, 2.5% difference, $100 million or so on the financial statements. However, very important last bullet on this slide, there were these decisions that were made in 2019 and 2020, the individual decisions for the actual grant of COLA per the board's authority per city charter. Those decisions, while they were, you know, materially different from the modeling assumption that we used 2 years ago, they were not very material in terms of the actual dollar impact on our liabilities. Those two decisions, even though a full 2% is different than a modified PERS approach of 2 and 1 1/4, and the same with the 2020 decision, the combination of those two decisions varying from what we modeled in 2018 was only $1 million in present value terms. So there's not a kind of a high stakes aspect or a big price tag from our perspective attached to the decisions that were made in 2019 and 20 varying from what we modeled in 2018. And the reason for that is if you think about kind of what the nature of our current retiree group is for FPDR2, many of them retired prior to 2013. So there is no daylight between modified PERS and 2% straight. And even those that did, you know, the majority of their service with the city is going to be for pre-2013. So even for the ones that have some post-2013 service that are already retired, there still isn't that much daylight, which is why the price tag associated with those decisions in our perspective is quite small in the grand scheme of things compared to the liability of the program. Scott, if you could turn on to the next slide, please. So, you know, we come to the board not asking for a decision on what the COLA would be in 2021, just simply wanting to know what assumption is okay for us to use as the adopted suite of assumptions to conduct the 2020 valuation that will inform the next couple of CAFRs, annual reports for the city, if you will. I'm going to call it a recommendation, but we would be certainly comfortable continuing to reflect that modified PERS approach. So kind of the service weighted blend of a 2% and a 1 1/4, unless the board provides us with alternate direction, and we would go with that alternate direction and use it in our valuation. So I wouldn't say that we have a recommendation here, but we also haven't been party to the decisions. So we would just like a direction and some adopted assumption. It could be a stay of the course assumption, so that we can incorporate this with the other assumptions that are mentioned on mortality and turnover and retirement, and get the full documented suite that we need in order to do those benefit projections each and every year for the future years, so we can come back and present the 2020 valuation results. So with that, I think that's our last material slide. There's 7 slides in the appendix, and those are, some of them have rather small fonts because there we're trying to document all of our recommended assumptions. But this is an action item for the board today. So Scott and Gary and I would be happy to field any additional questions on any of these as you see fit, but I appreciate the time and attention today.
So any additional questions from anybody?
Yeah, this is Trustee Lehman. I just had one on that last issue you were talking about, the COLA assumptions. Are you asking us if we have opinions on the COLA assumption? That's what I felt you were asking. So I was just wondering, and I was thinking about it before you even asked that.
Yeah.
So if we were just, since there's a potential that we could do 2% in a year, if we just put it in the valuation, at least we would know, you know, how it might affect us in the future. It doesn't bind us to do anything every year, but rather than try to play catch up every time we do something different, if we put the maximum liability that we have in here, and I don't know if it's a good idea or a bad idea, but at least it's something we wouldn't have to address or you ask the question. So what are your thoughts on that?
No, Trustee Lehman, great question. And yeah, it wasn't necessary. I guess in a sense, if it's an action item, we're asking for an opinion so that we can get an assumption to model things going forward. Not having been privy, not having reviewed the deliberations that took place in setting the actual decisions in 2019 and 2020, there was always a possibility that the board, based on most recent discussion, might be like, you know what? I think that the 2020 approach, which was a bifurcated 2 and 175, might be the direction going forward. It could be an individual sense of the board members based on discussions for those decisions. But for example, if that was a sense that it's like we may just kind of stay the course in that direction, we could update the assumption to be the 2.175 combo, 2.0, 1.75 combo that was used in 2020, just have that be the course going forward, which, talking out loud on this, might not be a bad way to go, because the straight 2 feels like it's at one end of the spectrum for possibility, and the modified PERS approach, which is a blend of 2 and 1.25, might, in a sense, be towards the other end of the spectrum, and the 2.175 combo could be in the middle. And as you noted, it is not in any way, shape, or form binding on any actual future decision. This is just more us trying to, as best we can, model what we think the obligations for the program might be in the future using a variety of assumptions, including this one.
So this is Josh. To Matt's point, though, I think that the key is if we lock in the assumption, then it doesn't cost anything to it, right? So if we lock in an assumption that we're going to automatically do some level, then it sort of is built into the system, and we have to cut costs in order to. I'd rather have us be somewhere in the middle, I guess, is what I'm saying. So to Matt's point.
Yeah, and the more he explains it to me, I don't understand exactly the purpose of this study like you guys do. So I'm just looking at it as I just want to be prepared in the future, but I think you guys are trying to guess exactly what's going to happen in the future. And while you're not going to be right, you're at least going to try to pick some numbers that are maybe somewhere in the middle rather than to go to extremes. So, so I get it now. I kind of understand what you're doing. That makes sense to me.
And let me, oh, sorry. I was just going to say.
Go ahead.
Is that we neither want to overstate nor understate, the plan liabilities, I think, is where we want to come out. And so I think the instinct to go somewhere down the middle makes sense, because, it's not like a budget where you're like, well, now we're prepared for it. So if it happens, we can fund it. It's that we're trying to get a really accurate number to drop into the city's liability and into our audit document of what we realistically expect the number to be. So I think if the board, was sort of united in saying, we really think we're going to do 2% every year, and we also think it's very likely that future boards will want to do 2% every year, well, then I would say we should talk about 2% because we don't want to understate the liability. But if there, remains uncertainty about how that will look in the future and how future boards will handle it, then maybe, adhering to something in the middle makes a little more sense. Sorry that I interrupted you earlier.
Yeah, I think to circle back to the points that were made by the board chair and by Trustee Lehman is, in essence, what we're going to be doing, we have to use a single assumption. We're not trying to guess what will happen in the future, but we do have to use some single assumption to develop numbers. And then what will end up happening is every 2 years when we evaluation, like we just did a couple slides ago, we'll come back and say, so, the actual board decision in this year and this year deviated from the assumption, and the magnitude of the deviation either added or subtracted this amount to the liability. The add or subtract at this stage in the life cycle of the program is very small. I noted it was only $1 million, which compared to the liability is not much. So if there's not a strong sense of the board of like 2% is the likely landing spot, or 1.25, the modified PERS is the landing spot, we may want to go a little bit more in the middle because we'll have less to report probably in terms of those deviations year over year.
This is Kathy. I appreciate everyone's comments on this, and my sense is that we, at least as this board has been, have erred more toward the upper end of that. And I personally be more comfortable with something that assumed that we would likely come in at 2% or 1.75, something close to what we did the past couple of years. So I would probably come up off the 1.25 to something, at 1.75, that would give us a range, an average range of between 1.5 and 2. I would personally be comfortable with anything 1.75 up to 2 for that second group, that second tier, but probably more in that range than the 1.25.
So I think what I hear, at least Chair Harwood and Trustee McLeod saying is that they would probably like to direct Milliman to adjust that COLA assumption to reflect what we did most recently, which is the 1.75 on service post 2013 and 2% on service prior to 2013. I don't know if there are, or if that's the sense of the rest of the board, but we do need, at the end of all this, when everyone feels like they've had their questions answered, we do need a motion to approve the assumption changes that the actuaries have recommended. And then we also need that motion to include direction for this COLA assumption if we want to recommend something specific.
Stacy, I usually try to leave the numbers to Kathy, but I certainly agree with the spirit of what she said here, which is we do as a board, we've tended to go higher, and I think that is not binding future decisions. I do think that is how we as a board see the COLAs, that they should be on the higher end.
And I'm in full agreement as well. So I would make a motion to accept Millman's presentation today and direct them to follow what we did last calendar year, which Stacy just spoke of, the modified between the 1.75 and the 2% as a number to use for next year. I think that meets all of our needs. And I think we, as a board, I think that's kind of where we've all been landing, so.
This is Kathy, and I will second that motion with the clarification that what we're doing is asking Milliman to incorporate an assumption for their COLA increase to be, for the long term, 2% on service prior to October 2013 and 1.75% COLA after that.
Thank you, Kathy, for that clarification. I think that's important. But yeah, no, everything that for what it's worth, everything I've seen in this presentation seems reasonable to me. So I'm not too worried about it. So so we can go ahead and vote on our one action item today. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. All those in opposition say nay. So we should be good. I think it's going to be pretty fluid right now, and I think that what I would tell you or all of you and what I've been telling elected officials is that right now we're in a situation that is we're sort of perpetually 6 months out from being back to normal. And so that makes it really hard, I think, for us to know exactly where we're going to end up. So I want us to be flexible going forward to the extent we can, but in terms of the content and the assumptions that Millman's presented, it makes perfect sense to me at this point to go ahead with that. So thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you
to the board.
Thank you.
Good to see everybody.
Pat and Gary, it's always wonderful to see your smiling faces. It's a great pleasure to work with you on all the, I really, really love actuarial stuff. It's so fun. I keep.
And those guys especially, they're so good.
They have a counseling program available, don't they, for city employees?
We're a weird group then.
I keep trying to recruit like future actuaries. I keep telling younger people, I'm like, I love my job, but you know what? If I did it all over again, I'd become an actuary. So anyone who's mathematically, I encourage them to look into it. But thanks for coming today. And I think that we can let you guys go unless you want to listen to the rest of this.
Sounds great. Thanks very much.
All right.
I think I'm good.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Take care. Stay safe.
Well, thank you all. And I think I'm up next, so I'm going to just dive right in and just give you a little update on what's been happening with the COVID claims that have been submitted as of August 31st of 2020. Just a recap of where we have been, and that started with the initiation of our administrative rules, which you all revised at our May 26th board meeting. What that has meant for us as claims handlers is just that the causation standard that we apply all the evidence to once we've looked at the application for benefits and other information is what we're considering. And so we've got, the rules in place and work to develop procedures so that we're all consistent in what we're looking at and how we're administering the claims, and all that's the kind of the behind the scene things. But what we were certainly considering for our members were the challenges that they faced when this whole thing hit, when COVID-19 hit, the closure of doctors' offices, and hospitals, and the lower numbers of patients being seen because they were focusing on the care of COVID patients, and everybody else was kind of put on hold, as we all know. And so what we did was adopt some changes, for members who file injury claims that are non-COVID. We have the requirement that they complete a attending physician report and a work status report, or have those completed for their injuries. And what we did is we reduced that standard. We knew that it was hard for them to get in to see these doctors. A lot of the doctors were conducting telehealth visits only. And so we wanted to make sure that we created standards and things that were consistent with the experiences our members would have, and then made some procedural changes also just to make sure that we were able to manage these claims effectively and quickly when they came in. And so where we are to date, our COVID by the numbers. So as of August 31st, we had 40 COVID-19 claims, and you've got your little chart there that breaks it down by fire and police. Of the 40 claims that were filed, 24 of them were approved. Of the 24 approved, 6 of the members did test positive for the coronavirus and suffered time loss and symptoms associated with the illness. I'm really happy to report that all have recovered and have returned to work. So that's a very good thing. The 12 claims that were withdrawn were really in the early stages of these claims. Again, people having exposures, but they realized that the exposures didn't result in a positive test or symptoms. So those claims were withdrawn. And then we had, as of August 31st, 4 claims that were pended. An update is that those 4 claims have subsequently been approved, and none of them involved a positive diagnosis of the COVID, of COVID-19, and have not had any serious illnesses with those last 4 claims. So overall, we've been very fortunate with the numbers that we've had. We're certainly keeping our eye open for the fall as we look at cold and flu season coming quickly, and symptoms that would mirror COVID-19 symptoms, a fever, cough, runny nose, those kinds of things. It may drive up the number of claims, and we may see more that are filed and then subsequently withdrawn because they end up having the flu or something and not COVID. And then, of course, we're certainly concerned for those members who may contract the virus in the setting of colder weather and the impact that it might have on their recovery. But so far, like I said, we've been fortunate. Those who have contracted it have recovered and returned to work. We continue to pay very close attention to these claims and get them processed as soon as possible and work within the very changing structure of the medical community and how they are seeing people, testing people, and just following the instructions of the medical provider on a case-by-case basis. And so far, we've had good luck with getting them in and processed. So that's what I have. It's kind of short and sweet. I hope that if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Hey, Kimberly, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So, we did intend through our rules changes to provide flexibility, as you pointed out. Through your claims administration, have you heard any feedback from members as far as are the current rules meeting their needs and their concerns when they have a suspected case of COVID and may need to isolate? Are they feeling that they can access benefits smoothly as we intended?
I haven't heard much feedback. The claims being approved, I think help. I think there was a relief when the rules were put in place and then the standards changed to more of a clear and convincing evidence standard if the member had COVID-19. But I would have to say I haven't gotten feedback like that, and I'll have to just reach out, and I'd be happy to report that from our liaisons. I'll reach out to them and see what they're hearing.
And how are members given access to testing, given that they have kind of unique exposure in their jobs? Do they have testing on a regular basis?
They have testing on a regular basis. Certainly in the early stages of the virus, it was kind of hit and miss which facilities would provide testing. And I will give a shout out to our liaisons who worked with the different facilities throughout Oregon, throughout the metropolitan area, I should say, to find out who was doing testing. Initially, it was kind of a smaller number of facilities doing that. Then it expanded, and then we found out, that the Legacy and some of the other clinics were doing it, and that they gave preference to first responders, which was great. And that was probably April, May, rather early on that the treatment facilities and that start giving preference to first responders for testing. So it's gone pretty well and improved over time.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
I would just like to clarify, Trustee Fouts was talking about regular testing, and I didn't know if she was referring to us being tested like on a regular basis or anything, or anything. That we're not doing that. There is, especially I think if you file a claim, then they get you in for a test because you have symptoms or you've been exposed. And we're working through these problems too with our bureaus, as far as it's changed a lot in the last few months, because it started out, there was a few different tests. Some work better than others. Some they told us not to even go anymore. But basically right now it's a test if you have been exposed or if you have some type of symptoms, then you are able to go test. But we aren't doing anything like regularly, weekly, daily, or anything like that in the Fire Bureau at least.
Yeah, and we haven't seen that in police either. Well, that's all I have, so thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
I'll take it back from Kim real quick, because I think the next two items are mine. Expenditure report. I think you all have it with you, but let me know if you want me to throw it up on the screen. What you have actually two reports, because you have the complete report for fiscal year 1920, which ended on June 30, 2020, and then you have 1 month of the current fiscal year fiscal year 2021 because August hadn't closed when we sent this out to you. So I'll just say a few things about 1920 since it is, the final report for the year. We did have lower spending. We finished the year within budget in all major categories, which is always what we want to do. We did have lower spending than budgeted in more areas than usual. We spent less on pensions than we had budgeted for, although we still spent 98% of our pension budget. And that is because we only had 9 retirements in fiscal year 1920, and we also had fewer deaths than usual last year, which is kind of interesting. We spent less on disability benefits, and that was almost entirely in lower medical costs. So we see that was impacted by COVID and the suspension of non-urgent procedures in the last couple of months of the fiscal year. So I would certainly not call that a trend. We also spent less on PERS contributions than budgeted, and part of that is real in the sense that there were not as many new hires who would be covered by PERS because of the low retirement numbers last year than we initially thought there would be. But also, I got nervous in the spring, as did the police finance manager and fire finance manager. And so we adjusted that budget up in the spring budget adjustment in case there was a significant amount of overtime, because at that time we were just not quite sure how the pandemic and then protests were going to impact overtime. And we do pay PERS contributions on overtime. And that overtime didn't materialize, at least before June 30th. It did materialize at police after that, but it didn't wind up materializing. So that's why we came in low there. We did spend a little more on return to work and light duty than budgeted, which is a good thing. It means those programs are being used, which is really nice. And then the underspending in budget was kind of nicely balanced by revenues coming in a bit lower than originally budgeted. Taxes, which are almost all of our revenues, were just a hair off. They came in at 99% of budget. And then miscellaneous revenue, which is mostly interest income, also came in a bit under budget. We had lower interest rates and also a slightly lower fund balance than we anticipated at the beginning of the year. And then interagency revenues, which are a pass-through mostly from police. When police and fire contract with third parties to provide services, they charge an overhead rate. We get part of that rate to cover pension and disability costs. Most of it comes from police. And that was lower because police continued to do less of that contracted work because of staffing shortages. But that revenue source may really drop in the future, as depending on if police is in discussions to sort of reduce their presence on the TriMet Transit Police, which is where most of that money comes from. So we'll see how that plays out in the future. And then for fiscal year 2021, there's really not anything important to say about it yet. August has closed since, but there's just nothing to really draw your attention to in fiscal year 2021. But are there any questions I can answer about expenditure?
This is Kathy. I do have one question. I think you said it, but my brain wasn't working as fast as you were speaking, so I didn't think about it. So on the Fpdr 3 pension contributions, they are not quite $2 million less than the budgeted amount. Is the reason for that, you said, because there were fewer retirements and so fewer new employees hired, and so the overall payroll was down that you were sending off to PERS?
And I apologize for talking fast. Oh, it's bane of my...
Oh no, I just wasn't thinking fast.
There were 2 reasons for that, Trustee McLeod. The first is exactly what you just said, that we only had 9 retirements. So we only hired, 9. I mean, that's not true. They actually did hire more than 9 because of vacancies. But hiring levels were lower than we projected because retirement levels were lower than we projected. But what contributed more to that was the fact that the budget was adjusted up in the spring budget adjustment process.
Oh, right.
Because of, the whole world, seemed to be on fire, and we were very worried about overtime costs. And it is a violation of local budget law for us to overspend the budget. So we went in with police and fire and adjusted that up. And then the overtime that we were worried about did not materialize, at least before June 30.
Okay, thanks. I did hear those things. I just didn't process them all. Okay.
No problem. Any other questions about spending or revenues? Anything like that? All right, then I will move on again because I think the next item is also mine, and just talk about August retirements for a minute. I don't have anything to add to the memo that I sent to all of you. So let me just hit the highlights of that, though it really was a remarkable month at FPDR. We had 62 service retirements, 48 police, and 14 fire. Before August, the most we've ever retired in 1 month was 39, which is a number we hit in April 2016 and July of 2011. So it's a lot more than usual. And in fact, that is the most, it's the most that we've retired in any entire year, except for a handful of times. Our previous highest 1 year mark was in fiscal year 0809 when in fiscal year 0607 when we had 94 retire. But except for just a couple of years, so retiring 62 folks in August is almost an annual record, let alone for 1 month. August was a 27 pay date month, as I think everybody knows, and we have another 27 pay date month this fiscal year in January 2021. So I certainly think it's possible that we'll break our previous annual record from 0607, which was 94. I certainly think we'll at least beat out our runner-up year, which our second highest year was in 0809 when we retired 73 folks. At the same time, I don't think January will have as many retirements as August did. I think it'll be smaller overall, but it will probably be bigger for fire and smaller for police. Fire did get a cost of living adjustment on July 1st, 2020. So that means there's more incentive for them to wait until January because they'll have higher pay in their final pay look back for those last months of the year. But police did not get a cost of living adjustment on July 1st. So they didn't have as much incentive to wait. And of course, this is a very unique year for both police and fire, which I think is prompting some folks to consider retiring sooner than they might otherwise. So we still have another 27 payday month to come, and we're just going to have a record-breaking year for retirements. So I also just want to take a second and give a special shout out to Beth Lloyd, our pension coordinator, who retired each and every one of these people and did it all on Teams and Skype and Zoom and FaceTime with totally new remote retirement processes. And her personal goal is to treat every person retiring as if they are the only person retiring. We know this is a big moment in our members' lives, and we're privileged to be part of it. And we want to honor that moment and their career of service. And Beth really does that every day. Somebody you guys don't ever get to see, but who is so important to our members. And then also a shout out to the financial analysts who also work for me and who calculate and verify all of those pensions. And nobody sees them, not the board and not the members, but they're behind the scenes calculating all those pensions. So it went really smoothly and was very successful. Yeah, we're on track to really, shatter the record books for retirements this year. Any questions or thoughts about that?
No, but I can appreciate that effort that required, and it's good of you to mention them for those efforts.
Yeah, I agree. Sam, anything else you want to cover for this?
I've just got a little bit on the FPDR updates and next meeting agenda.
That's what I thought. Go ahead.
Okay, for updates, just real quick, this year has been crazy. I think the staff has taken had to roll with a lot of different punches coming their way. COVID, how it impacted their work, how it impacted their home lives and their personal lives, how it impacted city budgets. So there's some furloughs. There are a lot of the racial tensions impacting quite a few of the people. More recently, we had the office closures because, a week off because of all the smoke. Smoke was miserable at home and people losing a week worth of work, although people were teleworking, but still impacted. Got some people that got kids in school trying to figure out how to keep their kids focused and at the same time do their own work. So it's been a tremendous amount of stress on the staff. They've done a very good job. You've heard about what the finance and pension people did for the August pay period, and they're going to be gearing up for the January period, and they're gearing up for the helping the actuaries. So there's a lot of work on that side. There's quite a bit of work going on the disability side too. We were going to start moving to paperless claims, and we're going to start that work about fourth quarter of this year. In other words, started about now. But we were forced to start that back in March and do an accelerated way of moving claims from paper to electronic and digital. So that was quite a bit of work for people, big shift on what they're doing. It's really hard to try to adjust to teleworking, trying to figure out how to make teleworking work at home. Some of the people didn't get laptops until later than others, and so they're all trying to do it. So there's a tremendous amount of work done by everybody. So we as a management team have been working really hard to try to give some flexibility to our staff with schedules. We now finally have, everybody now has laptops and equipment to work from home, which gives them flexibility to how they want to adjust it. We're still somewhat paper-centric bureau. So we have people that have to come in maybe one day a week or one day every other week to pull some of their work together. Now that we've gone to the electronic on the claims, that's reduced the amount of time they've been in the office. Nobody has to come in full time anymore because they have laptops. We've also looked to prioritize some of the work we're doing to take some of the pressure off people, doing different things. One of the big things that outwardly focused is the pension estimates. We used to do pension estimates for any time into the future. If you wanted one in 5 years, 10 years, or farther down the road, we'd help you because we felt it's important for people to do their pension planning. We've had to, especially since we had such a wave of pension estimates and actual pension calculations for the 27 pay periods, we had to shorten that down to about a year or two. We're going to keep it that short for a while until things can calm down, and then we'll start extending the period of time in the future that we'll look at for pension estimates. We had put off the state of Fpdr, and we're probably not going to do it for November. That takes probably 50 hours or more of work to put together. The one person who put in about 70% of those hours, he had gotten a better job with another bureau, had left, so we don't have the backup for him at this point. We're training another new financial analyst. She's doing great, but we're having her focus on the finance and pension side first before we get her comfortable in coming and helping us do the advanced reporting that's needed for a lot of the work we do, including the state of Fpdr. So it's just been really hectic, and the staff has done tremendous. We've worked really hard to keep it as invisible as possible to our members, and I think overall we've been very successful at that. So that's been our goal. So, you know, hands out to all the staff and the work they've done to make that happen.
That's great.
So,
and we miss Asha too. So, you know, in our office. So.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, Asha, we cannibalized Asha from Josh's office to replace Jason, who's the one that left elsewhere. Jason got a good offer. He's young and he's got a family member, so he took an offer that was beneficial to him. So, and Asha has been stepped in doing a good job, but we're still in the training mode for her with the finance. Because Fpdr is a weird beast, and so we've got to train her on how to be weird with her finances. Okay, so that's all the updates we have at this point. We're just going to continue to make sure that we can offer the best service we can in this environment. And, you know, it'll probably take another 3 to 4 months of teleworking for it to smooth out completely and with the digital claims. We're expected to be full teleworking through the end of this year. And then the city will have plans to start allowing more people back into the office. But I think a lot of our staff's just going to stay at home and continue to telework, which is fine with us. And we'll just go from there. So we'll keep you up to date in the next board meetings if there's anything exciting or different happening with the staff.
Sam, can I ask a question about telework? So with your employees working, you know, staff working remotely for the foreseeable future, what kind of support do you have as a bureau for data privacy and security, considering the sensitive nature of the data that's handled by the staff of Fpdr?
They are logging in from home into our network. So there's not another network. They're not going through anything else. So we consider this a very secure site. The whole city, you know, there's, I think, 4,000, 5,000 people teleworking for the city. And so the city's making sure that all their networks are secure as they normally would. So we're not using any other special applications or anything. We just, what we call tunnel into the city networks, and their desktop at home looks nearly identical to what it was in all their applications. So we don't have any outside looking in at it. And since most of the work is done electronic, there's no personal or confidential information being taken home from paper. We've, you You know, if they're showing stuff, we've reminded them that they have to protect their screens and their whatever documents or whatever thing they have away from their family and have a secure place. So we've reiterated that, but that was done when everybody was teleworking before. We just reiterate it. So I'm confident that we've done all we can to protect everybody's privacy.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Anything else?
Yeah, just the next couple board meetings that we have. We do have a board meeting in November 17th, the week before Thanksgiving. The only thing on the topic there is the financial audit report. And we get audited every year, and we'll have the auditors come in and give you that report. It's about a 30-minute presentation. Other than that, we have nothing else for that meeting. And then January, you've got the big heavy lift meeting, which is the 2020 levy analysis and actuarial value presentation. You'll see the Millman crew that was presenting today will be presenting that also. And then Stacy will give her annual budget presentation in January.
Excellent.
That's all I got.
Anybody have anything else? Or are we ready to adjourn?
Nothing else for me.
Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to November and January in particular because I'm a numbers guy. But I appreciate it. So we'll talk soon.
Good.
Be well.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah.
Have a good
All
one,
right.
everybody.
Yeah. Stay safe,
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.